Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Dialogues and Debates. My name is Chenai Chair, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at Mozilla Foundation. I'm really excited for our conversation today that we started at MozFest House, and it got rained out, but rain is always a blessing, so we're excited to have this conversation again. We will be talking about how AI has furthered and deepened marginalization in the African region and where it has created room for opportunity for us to confront the issues that we have. So I'm very excited for us to be, I'm standing in for my colleague, Rosaline, who's supposed to be moderating, but would be as unable to join us today. So I know the poster variations. I'm excited to be joined by our great speakers. We have Sandra Kwikiriza, founder and executive director of Her Internet. We have Commissioner Lawrence Mute, human rights lawyer and practitioner. Hopefully, we will be joined by Weam, Sudanese feminist and gender defender. And then lastly, we have Harvey Binamu, tech officer from Magamba Network. So before we begin and dive into the interesting conversations, we will be taking questions from the audience after the panel via LinkedIn and YouTube. So do raise any questions you have for our panelists. Right. So I'm going to start off with the first question because we're talking about confronting the margins and we really want to understand who we are talking about and what it means for technology to have an impact on those who are identified as being part of the margins. So my first question to all the panelists that I would like to invite you to unpack, and I'll start with Sandra first so that she can respond, is really unpacking context because we're not talking about technology coming from a random place. We are Africans who come from East and Southern Africa and have gone across the continent. How does technology and marginality intersect in your particular context? If you could just share examples from the groups you belong to or have engaged with from a marginalized perspective. So I'll start off with you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Chennai. It's great to be on this panel alongside amazing speakers, amazing people that I look up to and I'm inspired by. So in regards to your question around the context and how tech and marginalization intersect. So I speak for communities of structurally silenced women. These include lesbians, bisexual, and queer women. These include female sex workers. These include women living with disability. These include young girls and women living with HIV, as well as those who don't usually have meaningful access to technology. And how marginality intersects, I would like to reiterate a point I've made over and over again around access to tech itself, because tech and tech infrastructure is so expensive, but also because the infrastructure mainly is built around cities or urban centers, right? So for those who are not necessarily within the urban centers, even access to tech is a problem. Then tech itself or tech devices, smartphones and other smart devices are very expensive. And we know that for these particular groups of women, the economic disparity it's a huge gap between women generally as a gender, but also when you further explore the different identities of women, queer women, sex workers, women living with disability, then they are disproportionately affected by the economic gap in terms of looking for employment, but also having well-paying jobs. So access to tech is really, really expensive and difficult in that sense. And then also there are so obviously there is an increase in online violence, which obviously further marginalizes people, especially the groups that I work with and represent and belong to. So online harms are captured in different ways, but then away from the overarching point of online violence, there are some nuances. For example, the use of local languages, which are not necessarily incorporated within tech, within social media platforms, for example. So when someone is abused or harassed in local languages, or slurs are, written, commented in local languages, it's very hard for the social media platforms to flag this as harmful content, because language is not really explored beyond the colonial languages that we know, English, French, Spanish, and so on and so forth. So that also kind of further marginalizes the communities, because it's very hard to report the content to the platform, right? Because of the local languages and how that is manifests. And then, of course, algorithms on social media platforms also play a very important role in both positively and negatively. So social media algorithms, I'll speak in the positive light for firstly. For example, Instagram as a platform has algorithms that bring similar content, or content that you like, or content that people within your friend circles really interact with, right? But then if Sandra, for example, who is a queer woman living in Uganda, where it's a very homophobic context. For example, if I'm friends with some of my family members, or maybe my bosses on Instagram, right? And I'm interacting with majorly queer content, it's going to be a problem for me, because it's easy. The Instagram really mentioned that Sandra either follows this particular account, or has liked, or has interacted in some way with a particular content. So if it's mainly queer content, it's going to open up Sandra and others like her to further harm and marginalization from family members, from friends who maybe she was previously not out to. So in that sense, but at the same time, positively, that those algorithms kind of build community. So if I come across content that has been liked by another queer person, or another liberal thinking individual that I look up to, it will bring us closer, because we are kind of sharing, or we are interested in the same content. So social media algorithms in that sense influence both positively but also negatively. And when it is negative, it's really bad, because the harm is not just faced online, it's also faced offline. As we know, tech facilitated violence is quite broader than online violence. So for me, in a nutshell, marginalization and technology intersect, because specific communities of people are usually not part of the conversations, the wider conversations around how tech affects all of us. As end users, we have no say in how tech is developed, in how it's distributed, in how content is moderated. So that brings about a further divide in terms of marginalization. Thank you very much, Chenai.
Thank you so much, Sandra. You raised so many integral points in thinking about actually getting on the internet and then accessing the technology, to the inequities that arise when you're the platforms through the algorithms that moderate content for us, where we think we've hacked the system to be able to see the content we want, but the harms it exposes us to because of that ability. So the double-edged sword, as well as the violence against women. And I really love how you described the differences amongst women, because oftentimes the discussion is quite that it's a homogeneous group, but reflecting on the types of margins of people on the margins that you engage with. So I want to come over to you, Lawrence, particularly to also just reflect on this question in the ways in which you see technology and marginality intersecting, particularly with your experience around working on human rights.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, friends, colleagues. So I want to speak about the intersection between technology and disability. So that's what I want to focus on. And I want to begin by saying that for persons with disabilities, it is important to stress that technology is a boon, an extremely important factor in making the lives of people with disabilities better. We speak about independence. And so when you think about people with disabilities, remember, we're speaking about very many categories or types of disabilities. One could be blind, one could be deaf, one could have psychosocial disability, one could have intellectual disability, one could have mobility disability. So when you think across the board, the possibilities are immense. You're speaking about technology or artificial intelligence enabling you, assisting you, for example, to identify accessible routes. So then you no longer need to have a guide, a live guide, in order for you to move from one place to another place, because you're using technology to help you to identify a route. The question or questions of navigability, questions of mobility, moving from one place again to another place. Issues of voice recognition, again, depending on the disability which you have. So it's extremely important to stress that technology can and has been extremely important for people with disabilities. Of course, the point then would be that we're having this discussion from an African perspective. So that if again I point out that where you're speaking about a person with a disability who has high support needs, and who might then usually, perhaps in a Western or Northern context, anticipate that a robot might provide care for them, that obviously will not happen in a developing country like Kenya, because that sort of resource is not available. So I think that's the first point that I would wish to make. So technology as boon. But unfortunately, far too often again, you then have to look at technology as bane, as quite problematic. Because you see, a concern for people with the disabilities is that what technology quite often does is that it simply replicates society. So if society is biased, if the society is prejudiced, if the society works on the basis of stigma, then quite likely what you have is that the technology then replicates that. And so from disability perspectives, there's what we call ableism or discrimination, so that the moment you have this large language model who is preparing the data sets, which populate the technology, quite likely it's people who themselves are biased or are prejudiced, quite often against persons with disabilities. So then this becomes a big problem, and one which needs to be addressed. Now, just to give you an example, from a Kenyan perspective, if, for example, as a person with a disability, one wishes to apply for a fund, here in Kenya we call it the Hustler Fund, which has been issued, which is managed by government. When you apply for that fund, technology will determine where you should be placed. And if technology is not conscious to figure or to think, to know that it is dealing with people who perhaps sometimes have, whatever type of disability, then quite likely the amount of money which then particular people may get will be perhaps lesser or more, depending on whether they have disabilities or not. And again, another example, if let's say you are a stammerer, and stammering again could be a disability. So if you're a stammerer, and as part of an interview process, which, for example, is managed by an AI app, you are stammering, then again, whether you get that job or not is dependent on whether the algorithm says that we do not want people like that. So I think I should stop there. The point really I would wish to stress in terms of that intersection is that technology is extremely important. It enables us to live independently without having to rely on other human beings. But in terms of the practice of technology, we still are far away from the ideal. And in fact, from a developing country perspective, it's even even more problematic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I think the points you raise, and I really love that both of you, you and Sandra, have highlighted the opportunities that technology comes with, the enabler aspect of it, the community growth that comes with it, but the contextual analysis for us, particularly on the African continent, the limited access to resources, the reality that the tools that are being developed are actually quite discriminatory in that they're not inclusive of people, taking into account disabilities, taking into account different gender identities. So this is really, really important when we're thinking about confronting the margins and the design and the practice of technology, as you said. So I'm going to come to you, Harvey, just to hear also your insights on this particular question in terms of thinking about how does tech and marginality intersect. And I'm really excited to hear you speak because both of us being Zimbabwean, we for a long time was a country with the highest cost of data. I think we still are, like just 1 gigabyte would cost you like $30. So I'm really, really excited to hear from your point in terms of this, like how does tech and marginality intersect?
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, colleagues. So for Magamba Network, we are in a space where the marginalized are the majority. So to give context, in Zimbabwe, 70% of people live in rural areas. And to give you further context, I think 90% of 4G and above speeds are in urban areas. So what you have is a situation where you might have communication, you might have connection, but you can't watch a YouTube video. Now, what we do, our core business is getting the youth involved in democratic processes. How we started off was satire videos, and would share those. Or back in the day, it was on DVDs, CDs. So what we've always specialized in is how do we take the processes that are inherent for democracy and how do we share them with the youth? What we start off with is satire. How do we make it engageable? How do we make it funny? And we're laughing, but these are serious issues. Now that developed further, and what the situation in Zimbabwe is we have a single broadcaster, and they're not always showing what's going on in parliament. And again, back with the numbers, I think 60% of Zimbabweans have access to the national broadcaster. So everyone else doesn't know what's going on in parliament. So Twitter came about. We started using Twitter to go into the gallery and share what was going on in parliament, opening it up, so to speak, open party. Now, using a simple phone, we opened up the process to the entire country. We allowed some sort of engagement, and it was back and forth happening on social media. And in an instant, we now had the process and discussions spreading beyond what was just a privileged few. Now, going further, connectivity is a challenge, like you said, data prices, and rural areas. We came up with what we call a rural kiosk. The idea was, how do we share our content? Because at our core, it is a media company. How do we share the skits, the informationals, and the discussions around the democratic process with people in the rural areas? Connectivity is a problem. We're not going to start up our own mobile network company. It requires quite a bit of resources. And we thought, okay, we know where people congregate. Let's come up with a device where we put our content, and when the person goes for their weekly shop, or they're going to the veterinary, or the activities are more or less around rural life, they can connect to it, download the content, and go share. Now, this was informed by a study by IMS FOIO, where they say in the rural areas, one phone is used by 8 people on average. They actually have the order. It's the owner of the device, the mother first, older sibling, father, friend, and going down that order. So for us, tech and marginalization is how to amplify and how to reach. Now, if we try and bring AI in there, it gets a bit complicated because Zimbabwe has sanctions around it. So a lot of American companies or Western companies are reluctant to provide service. You can still get around it, but if you somehow manage to have internet, you now need to figure out VPN and an external phone number to sign up. So before we even start getting around the algorithms and how it has been trained is biased. We need to connect. So that's more or less our context around marginalized communities.
Thanks so much, Harvey. I really appreciate the fact that you've uplifted the youth. I think for quite a long time, the African continent is considered the youngest and therefore the most opportune if you're going to look for cheap labor. But it's also one of those issues of like, how do you integrate them into actually being part of the conversation? And that's such as the work of the Open Pali Initiative. And I also really like that you've used technology to meet people where they are in terms of like putting it in a place where it's accessible. So that for me is like really us having this intersectional conversation where we're highlighting the different communities, the opportunities that are there and the challenges in terms of connecting through technology. So I think we have Weam on the call. Let me just see. They might have just joined us. Well, just they dropped off connectivity issues as well. So I am, whilst we wait for Weam to rejoin the call, I am going to then move on to the next question, because I think there are so many intersections with what the panelists have mentioned, particularly talking about structural marginalization, connecting to disabilities, and thinking about that rural and urban divide, which is largely the context that we exist in on the African continent. The second question that I then have to panelists, and you can also build up on the previous answers, is in what ways do the current issues that emerge, particularly misinformation and disinformation or online gender-based violence, as Sandra has mentioned, impact the marginalized groups' experiences or shape their lives? Because we know then, you know, the advocacy is having access to technology to enable our lives. But what happens if you're part of the margins when issues arise such as misinformation and disinformation or online gender-based violence? And I will start with you, Lawrence, actually.
So I think that from our perspective of a disability, we experience a lot of so disinformation. If we take disinformation as an example, so effectively, here we're speaking about information which is consciously put out there, to create, deliberate harm to people. And the fact that quite often you don't have the possibility on your fingertips of, responding to certain things which are put out there means that, for example, when people say things about you, communicate wrong messages about you, you're not easily able to respond. An obvious example information will be put out there about them. These are disabled colleagues. So information will be put out there about them. And, you need to be able to respond and respond quickly, respond effectively. And quite often then that does not happen. And then I think it goes back to an important question, which we need to speak about. The question of design. That actually when the people who design technology do it, they should actually ask themselves, how do we design technology in a way that is usable and accessible by everybody? So that if I want to use Twitter, it will not be too cumbersome. Okay, now I think it's called something else. So if I want to use X, it will not be difficult for me to respond quickly to something which has been said about me, because I'm still trying to figure the interface, because it takes me too long to move from one part of the interface to the other part of the interface. And from disability perspectives, there's what we call universal design. This is the idea that when you design a product, design it in such a way that it is usable by everybody. Indeed, when you make a building, so when you design a product, a phone, a website, design it in a way that actually is usable by everybody. I'll give you another example. When you go onto some websites, what you encounter quite often is that they want to prove that you are who you are. So you encounter something which says that you should confirm that you are not a robot. Now, how do you confirm you're not a robot if you're blind? And there's some squiggles which you're supposed to do, which come up on the screen. So quite often you cannot even go onto the interface at all because you are unable to confirm that you're not a robot, unless now you can find someone to come and do the deed for you. So you can see then connectedly, you go back to the discussion on disinformation or even malinformation, misinformation, because you're not able to respond to things which are put out there about you quickly and effectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. That point that you raised around, having to prove you're human, it's also that layer of the assumption that what is used as an image for everyone to also agree to prove that they're human. It's like, say, for example, when they say a bicycle, assumes everyone has the same shared understanding or same shared visualization of what that system is. And that design aspect is so important, particularly in terms of then how it shapes the interactions on the platforms and having that affected life in terms of the misinformation, for example, that might happen and how best to respond to it. And I'll pass it on to Harvey as well to just respond to this question in terms of some of the issues that we see emerging and then how they shape lives of those who are on the margins.
All right, thank you. I think I'll start off from the misinformation and disinformation impact. We are fresh from an election, so things are very exciting on the social media. From what seemed to be happening during the election is we were not getting fake images or AI-generated images. We were getting original content, but mislabeled to deceive. So what that required was a lot of investigation to see if what was claimed on the image had happened in the way it happened, and a lot of times it was, but they would construct a narrative to make either side look bad. So we haven't seen a proliferation of quote unquote fake images coming through, but there is one interesting context. So what tends to happen in our society, it is family and social ties based. So if someone receives an image, their first instinct is to share with family members or from work to verify if that will perceive this action as you spreading misinformation, and they restrict that spread. So from their point of view, they are stopping misinformation. But from us, you're restricting someone from actually verifying if what they are sharing, what they've seen is correct. And just to feed on the earlier response, when these technologies are developed, I don't think they are aware that there are small societies like Zim where everyone is tied, and the best way to find out what the truth is to just shop around from your close associates. Yeah.
Thanks, Harvey. I think that then comes to the point where you talked about, one device being used by 8 people and the hierarchy of who has access. And in a similar situation, where the issues that we see around misinformation and disinformation, it's the person who probably has ownership, who, takes the device and sees verifies the image and therefore limits people's ability in that context. And I think for me, what I'm picking up in your response is also just the reality that I think some of this tech is not designed with that community perspective, which we all currently, which a majority of us exist in, and that guides our access to tech, guides our access to innovation, because we often come from that community perspective. And so looking at you, Sandra, as well, to respond to this, to think about how does the current issues that we see around tech actually impact or shape the lives of the marginalized groups that you earlier spoke about?
Thank you, Chenai and Lawrence and Harvey. I particularly like the point that Commissioner Lawrence raised around, proving that you're human, because the data sets used are not usually from the context of Africans, or what, for example, traffic lights look like in our cities and countries, for example, or what bridges look like. So I really love that point. So back to your question on how current tech issues, specifically misinformation and disinformation, actually shape our experiences. Of course, misinformation and disinformation, largely touted by social media platforms, shapes policies and laws in our countries, as we know. So in Uganda, for example, the anti-homosexuality law was largely introduced due to misinformation and disinformation, that queer people were recruiting young children into this and were paying them large sums of money. So when you look at that kind of narrative, any parent would be very enraged around, protecting their children, protecting their family members, and so forth and so on. And so it was a huge public discourse around how queer people are recruiting children into homosexuality, which is not the case. But because social media ran with it as disinformation, our politicians ran with it as disinformation, people we look up to in society ran with it in terms of what this information was packaged to look like. And there's even an example of a particular student in a boarding school who was who kind of set it off. But this was all false information. And this led to the shaping of a very oppressive law that we thought we had fought 10 years ago in 2013, 2014, but now we find ourselves still in the same boat. So it really, really shapes policies and law in the countries, in the context that we come from, in ways that further oppress already marginalized groups. And so in that way, it also prevents these communities from meaningfully participating in both civic and public discourse. So it will be very hard for a queer person to be taken seriously if they say maybe they want to contest for parliament. For example, in Zimbabwe, I'm sure it would be very hard for a queer person to contest for a presidential seat or for parliamentary seat or for any, public position because of the outrageous stories out there. For example, I know in maybe Burundi or Rwanda, I'm not so sure about the country, there's this whole notion that queer people prevent rain from falling. And so in cases of drought, then they point at the nearest queer person person perceived to be queer, because sometimes not even your real identity is just perceived to be queer because of how someone expresses themselves. But you see how it kind of, you can't take part in village meetings or town halls because you're bringing that drought, you're preventing the rain from falling, which is so outrageous, honestly speaking. And of course, tech, specifically social media, kind of furthers this narrative. So this means that it also opens up communities and individuals to further violence, both online and offline. I like Harvey's point around fake pictures or fake news or whatever, generated mostly by AI now. If a woman is to be, we know in the African context, one of the weapons used to silence women is through slut shaming and body shaming. And some of these things are done using tech by producing deep fakes or fake images, my face onto someone's body or, next to someone. And in that way, it kind of further compounds the whole experience of online violence that is already experienced by a marginalized community, a marginalized individual. So this kind of also opens them up further to violence. Then, of course, this entirely pushes an already marginalized community to further to the margins of society. If misinformation and disinformation are touted in a way that it impacts an entire community, an entire group of people, opening them up to online violence, preventing them from participation in civic and public discourse, it pushes them further to the margins than they already were. And instead of going 5 steps forward, we end up going five steps backwards, which is also impending on our organizing, how we organize as a community, how we mobilize our friends, networks, but also strategic partnerships, because we find ourselves in a situation whereby communities or organizations or individuals who are previously allies are not going to stand by and support or protect a group of people who are rumored to be recruiting young children into, sexual vices, right? So it already just kind of further pushes an already bad situation into a worse situation. Yeah, thank you very much.
Speaking, if I may jump in.
Yes, please.
Speaking about deep fakes, just think about it. How do you determine a deep fake? Now, for all of you who are what is called normal, those of you who are not disabled, so the norm is that you're normal, you're not disabled, usually you would use multiple senses to determine, for example, that you're dealing with a deep fake or not. You'll use, well, I was going to say you'll use your smell, but perhaps not, depending on where the deep fake is. The point I'm making is that if, for example, you're dealing with a deep fake of a politician, a local politician, so the expectation is that if you are deaf, you would see him and you will try to figure, so fake or not fake. But you see, you will not be able to hear the voice of the politician. If you're blind, you'll hear the voice of the politician, but you will not be able to see him. So at that very practical level, you can see the challenges, are multiple as far as figuring, disinformation or indeed misinformation is concerned. And I think it sort of leads me to something which I said a couple of weeks ago when we attempted to do this panel the first time, which really is that society needs to be conscious that actually there should be no such thing as abnormal, which also by extension means that there should be no such thing as normal. So we should not be attempting to standardize and to normalize. But unfortunately, technology demands that we standardize and we normalize because technology uses algorithms. So algorithms are looking for averages. So you can see the kind of problems then which we get into, because one cannot be average, one cannot be standard when they are disabled. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lawrence. Harvey, do you want to add anything on before I move on to the next question? You're on mute.
Sorry. I think we're good. We're good. Thank you. We can move on to the next question.
Thanks so much. Lawrence, I'm really appreciative that you raised it, because when you said it a couple of weeks ago at MozFest House, it really stuck with me. And thinking about the amount of investment that's going in, particularly for technology for development. We're looking at AI coming in to support sustainable development goals. And we're looking at AI coming in to help, climate change, predict climate issues. But it's really being tested to see if it can fit the norm versus it actually working towards the different scenarios and working around, as you would put it, like stopping to standardize, but actually responding to the abnormalities in all of us. And I really appreciated that point and the connection that also has been raised by Sandra on these issues, in terms of how then what happens online shapes our lived realities in terms of policies. And oftentimes there's this assumption that, like, what happens online is not a big deal because, we live in a different world. So we're going to make different decisions. And the actual reality is what is being put across as content that people are consuming also fits into particular narratives that are already existent in our societies and contexts, which actually makes it then sort of like tech is not coming in as something that's particularly new, but it's just amplifying already existent cultural and social issues that we have that amplify the lives of those who are already on the margins because they're not included into these processes. So coming into an action point, and I hope our audience has questions that they're getting ready for because we're going to jump into the Q&A soon. There is this resolution that was put forward by the African Charter for Human People's Rights, where they put forward in 2021 a need to undertake a study on human and people's rights and artificial intelligence, robotics, and other new and emerging technologies in Africa. This is probably one of the first documents that recognizes the need for there to be more kind of understanding and nuancing to the harms that all of you have mentioned in talking about the impact in society. Now, I would like to ask, and I'll start off with you, Sandra, as a question. What do you think is there an opportunity for the groups you've mentioned on the margins to claim choice, agency, and ask for accountability when engaging with AI? That's for me as a question in that.
Thank you, Chenai. And following up on what you just mentioned around the declaration or, thank you from the African Commission on People and Human Rights. Our laws, or let's say our governance systems on the continent, in Africa, need to advance at the same level that tech is advancing. We can't fall behind because tech is advancing at a very fast rate, and I believe that the onus is on us on the continent, but also on the governance systems, our leaders, and people who usually interact with the Western countries to be able to follow suit and take that and be proactive around advancing at the same level. I mentioned this at MozFest Kenya, that if a thief in the offline world is treated as a criminal, why isn't that the same for someone who misappropriates someone's data or steals their money using online systems and so on and so forth? Like, we need to get to that level whereby we are advancing at more or less the same level as tech, because we can't catch up. We can't catch up if we fall behind even one step. So that resolution is really welcomed. And it says a lot about how our leaders are also not just impacted, but are looking at these issues of AI, machine learning, generally tech development seriously, and their impact on the people that they lead and the people that they serve. So this also goes on to mean that there needs to be a diversity of voices in rooms where tech-related decisions are being made. The world has evolved and moved past data being compiled from particular demographics, right? We've moved beyond a particular race making decisions. We've moved beyond a particular gender making decisions. We've moved beyond ableism and how that impacts decision making in tech, in the tech world. So I think also as tech companies or big tech, they need to be proactive when these decisions are being made, when tech is being developed, when they're still in the design or the literature review phase. This needs to be taken into account. Who is in the room? Who has a voice when this is happening? Because we've seen how, for example, facial recognition systems are mislabeling Black people as monkeys or gorillas or something like that. And honestly speaking, in 2023, that is a shame, because what do you mean Black people are being mislabeled as monkeys, right? Like, there's a clear distinction between monkeys and Black people, and we are human, So diversity needs to be taken into account in the rooms where these decisions are being made. At the same time, tech companies and tech developers need to listen to the end users, but listening with the intention to find long-lasting solutions, not just band-aid solutions. So if we say, for example, facial recognition is mislabeling Black people, right? Then it's not, oh, let's take out the word monkey and gorillas from the data sets that label that people know. It's how deeply can we think about a long-lasting solution to ensure that all of us in the world are being treated as human and are being treated with dignity, even as the technology world advances so rapidly. So these companies and developers need to listen to the end users with the intention to find long-lasting solutions and not just the band-aid solutions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It's so intriguing, particularly the example you've used around facial recognition, how we've seen the work of the Algorithm Justice League, for example, in the US, actually lead to the ban of use of facial recognition in, I think, particular US states, or even IBM pulling back, yet that technology is being exported to the African continent under the guise of security. So you see that there's sort of like a power dynamic as well in thinking about the opportunities that we can take to claim choice, agency, and accountability as these new technologies are being implemented. I'll turn to you, Harvey, if you also have some insights in terms of thinking about what are the opportunities for those on the margins to actually then have a choice, accountability, an agency in the way in which we interact with tech. Harvey, not sure if you're frozen or on mute. We'll just, there we go. Yeah, we've got you.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the things I enjoyed about going to MozFest was getting in a room and hearing diverse opinions. One thing about Africa and the way we are approaching some of these challenges is we believe we have the ability to leapfrog. I am grateful that there are people who are pushing for us not to be left behind. But from what I see in our history in our use of technology, we are on the precipice of a leapfrog. As an innovative organization, we are always looking at indicators to say, okay, what are people using? What's the behavior like? And it's almost there. When AI comes, I doubt it will come in the form that we know it as someone on a web browser typing questions. It will most likely come on or your dumb phones. Someone will create an interface that links the SMS to more or less where this AI model sits, and the boom will happen. All of a sudden, the access will happen. And that is more or less where we are working in terms of the margins. So, okay, we can't connect them, or we can't create the conversation in the way that this software has been created. Where are the people? Where can we meet them? And how can we perhaps help accelerate that leap? But again, I would emphasize this with the conversations I had. I definitely appreciate those who are pushing so we're not left behind. But just in case, we have plan B.
Okay. If I may jump in.
Yes.
You mentioned the facial recognition technology. Now, I think there are broad policy considerations which we should be addressing at the continental level. Now, I think the African Union has a working group on artificial intelligence, which is supposed to prepare a blueprint on that. I'm not sure, the extent to which that has been done. So the point I'm making there is that clearly there are many critical policy considerations where directions can be given from the continental level, and then where states can figure, collectively, best approaches for Africa. Now, of course, from our perspectives as Africans, African citizens, African stakeholders, we usually would fall back on the language of human rights, to protect us from the adverse consequences of technology, whether brought about by states or indeed by private actors. Now, you look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and there are certain provisions which anchor how Africa should address rights issues, in relation to technology. And I think that's a context within which you mentioned the resolution of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I should begin by saying that when I was the special rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa, I spearheaded the development of the 2019 Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. And that declaration includes a principle. So I should explain that the declaration is a soft law instrument. So it's not hard law in the sense of the African Charter. It's a soft law instrument, so it guides interpretation. And Principle 39 of the declaration obligates states to ensure that the development, use, and application of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and other similar technologies by internet intermediaries are compatible with international human rights law and standards, and that they do not infringe on the rights and freedoms of Africans. So then, going now to this resolution, which has been passed more recently in 2021 by the African Commission, Resolution 473, on the need to address the implications for human rights of artificial intelligence. I believe that what the Commission is doing presently is collecting I would expect that the Commission would be engaging with the African stakeholders so that then they ensure that
I think I'd lost you there for a minute, Lawrence. Just want to see if you are done with your intervention. I think I got most of it. I think I might have lost Lawrence. But in summary, I think I got most of the intervention being around like the policy opportunity, the need then for people on the margins or groups, civil society organizing people to actually provide the necessary information, be part of the process in order to see change. So we've actually gotten to close to the end of our session. And so I don't think I have any questions, but I hope that you can always find a way to get in touch with the panelists if they do emerge. So I would like to then ask the panelists, always in true fashion in closing a moderation session, to end on a note of hope. What would be, so we're going to try 2 words this time. What would be your 2 words in thinking about confronting the margins? What do you think are like a phrase, okay, or 2 words that people can take away as an action item in terms of confronting the margins? And I'll start with you, Sandra, so that we can close off.
Thank you, Chenai. My 2 words are accountability and transparency at all levels, governance levels, tech development levels, the whole notion of AI, so machine learning, data sets, big data, everything, as well as end users. We all need to be accountable and transparent around what this tech advancement means for us, what the future is, its impact on human rights, and its impact on all of us humans as a collective, but also at individual level. So accountability and transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. 2 words: inform and inspire. More or less our guiding principles. We will continue to try and inform those at the margins. We'll continue to try and inspire the dialogues and integrate them into the greater discussion.
Thank you. So we've got accountability, transparency, informed and inspired. And lastly, Commissioner Mute, your 2 words.
So my 2 words, actually 1 word and 1 phrase. So the word is involvement, involve. It's critical that marginalized groups, whether they are disabled people, women, or LGBT, that they be involved in this, in the preparation of AI algorithms. Involvement extremely critical. Then the phrase, one size does not fit all. So the phrase is, let's not have solutions which assume that you can normalize, you can standardize. So I think for me, those are the 2 key messages that I would wish that people leave with from this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Those are very powerful interventions. My 2 keywords are intersectional and community oriented. And I think we've actually come up with best practice principles in these 2 words in terms of engaging marginalized communities. On that note, thank you everyone for joining us. There are other sessions that couldn't take place that are going to happen. I think there's one at 4:30, looking at chatbot and database violence. So you can find that update. And I really want to extend my thanks to the production team behind the scenes and our fantastic panelists who've made this session possible. And on that note, I end this dialogue and debate, and take care, everyone.